Alright, what's going on, guys? It's Trey back again here to bring you another video. This one's going to be talking about superhero teams, just in general. The big three I'm going to be talking about pretty much are going to be the X-Men, of course, pretty much being one of the biggest superhero teams. Then from the DC side, we got the Justice League, and the big Marvel team, which would be the Avengers, at least the big Marvel team aside from the X-Men. So there are quite a few comic books with different superhero teams and lots of different ideas that writers employ to kind of put teams together and things like that. I mean, there's so many different types of Avengers teams, and there's you've got different Justice League teams, and now the X-Men have actually split ways, and you have two straight up X-Men teams. So now part of this is obviously just trying to sell more books because those characters sell well. And Ben has proved with the Avengers, if you just make a whole bunch of Avengers teams and just throw different big characters in there like A or B list characters, then as long as the writing is decent, you're going to get quite a few sales off of that. So there are tons of different teams and different iterations of these teams. There's been tons of different versions of the X-Men. Even it's always changing. The X-Men are always constantly changing all the time. The X-Men that we have now are, it's not the same as the X-Men we had even a year ago or even, 5-10 years ago. You've got characters dying, like, for example, Jean Grey. You've got, other characters coming and going. And you've got characters like Wolverine sort of, joining different Avenger teams. So, how do I feel about it? Well, I do like the concept of superhero teams. I do think if they're done properly, they can be written very well. They can be very interesting. They can take characters that by themselves might not work so well and will work in, the team-based setting. I'm not necessarily sure if a lot of the X-Men characters would ever work by themselves. Would Cyclops ever work in his own comic book? There have been a couple little Cyclops books, like, side books, but nothing that's been long-term, long-lasting. He's had a couple little, one-shots or mini-series, 4 or 5 issues, this kind of stuff, but nothing for Cyclops has really lasted very long, and I don't think the sales in them have been very good. Whereas you have characters like Captain America that can really have their own, entire comic book series to themselves. A lot of the X-Men characters, I just can't see that. I can never see Jubilee really having, her own long-lasting series that goes for, 100 issues or more. Most of the X-Men characters actually are pretty much like that. We saw in the 90s when they had a huge boom in the X-Men that they had a lot of different characters that would have their own spin-off series like Gambit, and Wolverine started, and Wolverine has lasted, but aside from that, most of the other characters that they tried just didn't seem to work by themselves. In a team setting they worked great, but by themselves they didn't really, they didn't get that exposure, and it just didn't seem to work out very well for them. Then on the other hand, you have teams like, the Avengers, which kind of started out as their own comic book series. You had all these different characters in their own first. Captain America, way back when, in the 40s and that, was actually used as like a propaganda machine. Then they, kind of in the 50s, they started to get to the point where they didn't really know what to do with them anymore, and they kind of, the character was kind of lost. And eventually, I'm pretty sure his comic book got actually canceled. And then eventually with the Avengers, they brought him back and stuff, and then, he's had his own running series for a long time. So that exposure sometimes, too, can help. The same can be said pretty much for Justice League. They're pretty much the same thing. You just basically take all the best characters from DC Universe and throw them into a comic book. This topic, the reason why I kind of did this video is because they're having a lot of big things happening with superhero teams lately, even bigger than the last couple years. You've got the relaunch of DCU, where they finally put back the Justice League as it should be, in my opinion, and have done it properly. Have realized that this has the potential of being the biggest comic book series we do. You take all the best characters we have and you put them all together into one book. That could outsell everything else because you get the crossover appeal. Guys that are fans of Batman will come and buy this. Guys that are fans of Superman will buy this. Green Lantern will buy this, and then you put the best talent you have on that. I think that makes sense. From their perspective, to have that kind of a team, that kind of book with that kind of talent, with Jeff Johns and Jim Lee doing the art. Of course that's going to be like a women, but it just seems like a no-brainer to do that. And then on the Marvel side, the Avengers have almost always been, one team of the Avengers has almost always been the top seller for Marvel, and it just seems to have been that way for a while. Now, of course, other things, with the big events and stuff, will take over and and push sales higher, but it always kind of comes back after those end and everything to the Avengers kind of being on top. So, I do think that these stories can work. We've also seen it in cartoons a lot. You see the Avengers cartoons on now. Justice League was on before, and I think if they put enough effort into them, they can be pretty much the best stories that the comic book companies can put together, because you have all of these different characters coming together. So, which of these teams is the best, or which one do at least I prefer the best? When I break it down and I look at them, Justice League and the Avengers are the most similar of the big three. They're pretty much just one, each universe's version of the same idea, which is just take all the best characters you have and throw them into a team. The only thing with Marvel is that Spider-Man is not always, and Wolverine has not always been an Avenger, because they weren't always the biggest characters. Spider-Man was Marvel's, one of Marvel's biggest characters always, but for some reason they just didn't put him in the Avengers, way back when they were putting the team together. I'm not sure exactly why that is. Probably, just for one reason or another, they decided not to. On the DC side of it, the Justice League has kind of been a mess for the past few years, since they've done this relaunch, in my opinion anyway. You had a lot of Justice League teams where they didn't have Superman and Batman on them. And I just think that that's a mistake, because you kind of want to have those characters in those teams. The X-Men, for example, now that they've split off and everything, they've actually become two teams, kind of. And they're always changing their roster out to keep the story interesting, which I think is good. It's necessary to do. But I still think, you kind of always have to have either Wolverine or Cyclops at this point in the X-Men. You can't really have the X-Men without Cyclops. It's hard to see it. Whereas, the Avengers and Justice League, they've tried to do it without the main characters. They've tried to do it, without having Cap in there, without having Superman and Batman in there. And in my opinion, it doesn't really work as well. I mean, they can do okay, and the stories are pretty interesting, but you kind of have to have those marquee characters in there to lead the group. Justice League and the Avengers are pretty much the same concept, just having the best characters from each universe in the team, and that pretty much being it. The X-Men are different, very different. They are, from the get-go, from the beginning, they were designed as a team. They were conceived as a team idea. And they've also been the one that seems to have, in my opinion anyway, changed the most, and at least for me, been the most interesting of the three, where, they kind of, being that they were designed as a team together, the characters were all put together with Professor X, originally as putting them together, they've kind of grown together, and they have, a lot of history together, and it doesn't feel like it's just a ploy to make, just to put all the great characters in there and make money off of it. X-Men really feels like it's designed from the get-go as that type of story, or that type of, comic based on a group, whereas the others are just, put together. So I think that, obviously from sales in the past, 30, 40 years, we've seen that it can work when you put together all these big characters. But I think that, from a hardcore fan standpoint, at least in my opinion, you kind of have to respect the X-Men a little bit more than the others, because they were designed as a team. They started as a team, and they've been successful. A lot of other books where you have, characters designed as a team like that, they usually, a lot of times they don't do very well. Sometimes they do. You have books in, like DC has had Teen Titans for a long time. Plenty of other groups, in both Marvel and DC, and even, other comic book companies like Image with Guardians of the Globe and stuff like that. And they can work. I think it's just it's really hard to write that type of story with all these different characters interacting and everything. But for me, for some reason, I just feel like X-Men stand above the rest, just because, all these characters and the way that everything has happened to them. You have some great classic moments in history. When you think of the X-Men, you think of the team as a whole a lot of times. You might think of Wolverine, you might think of Cyclops, but you kind of think of them as a whole. Now they're changing that, and they're trying to separate them into two, which to me just sounds like they're trying to kind of sell more. And maybe for, the X-Men versus Avengers, they're trying to get Wolverine off of the key X-Men team. I may do a video talking about that event coming up, because I think that's a very exciting event. I think that will sell really well. Something that we've kind of always wanted to see was a big, event where the X-Men and the Avengers go at it. I'll go into that more in detail and look at the members themselves. But this isn't about which team is more powerful. I mean, I think it's kind of obvious that if you take all the best characters out of a universe and you put them into one team, that kind of will make them just be more powerful right off the bat. That's just kind of the way it is because you took them and you put them together like that. Whereas with the X-Men, it kind of feels like they're just organically, naturally, they are a team by themselves. You can see characters like Wolverine go off, but most of the other characters, you kind of are used to seeing them in that group, and I don't know if they would work by themselves, in a long-running series. In fact, I don't think they would. I don't think Cyclops would ever really work in a long-term series. So when it comes to the big three, I really have to kind of side with X-Men as being the best in my opinion. The most interesting anyway. They've evolved the most over time. They've had they've remained relevant. You haven't had lulls in their in their comic books where they've kind of sucked for a while. I mean, they have had down times, but compared to the others, I just see them as sort of being founded as a group, and that they make sense as a group, and that they are probably the most interesting in their history versus Justice League or versus the Avengers. So in my opinion, I think you have to go with the X-Men as being the best of all the superhero teams, just because of that, because they were founded as a team, because they started as a team. They weren't just thrown together like the others are. They really, it makes sense for them all to be together, being as how they're all mutants, and they all, share that in common. They have to kind of band together to survive. Whereas the other teams are just forced together, really, just to protect the Earth or whatever, just because they're the best, essentially. So yeah, in my opinion, I got to pick the X-Men out of these three. I think the X-Men are the most interesting. I think that they're the best as a team. Let me know what you guys think. Feel free to write a comment or do a video response talking about the big three and superhero teams. Which is your favorite, and how you feel about the subgenre of comics when it comes to groups and teams. Later, guys. Peace.